All the law and the prophets built upon love for God, love for neighbor. You want to know how? Let's just take the 10 Commandments as an example. Love for God and love for neighbor. Love for God, first table. What is it? He's God. There is no other God. He's God. Don't even make a God that looks like him. Don't even have a God in his sight. That's love for God. Do you see that? And the second table, you look over here, the other one, and you're seeing love for neighbor stuff, like love your neighbor. Well, what's it look like to love my neighbor? Well, don't lie. Don't lie to them. Don't steal from them. Don't murder them. Don't commit adultery. And don't covet, right? You're beginning to see now, oh, now I see. So love for God, love for neighbor are the platforms from which the 10 Commandments come. But then you have now in the case law system of the Old Testament, you have examples of what it means to love God and love your neighbor in every area of life. For example, in the judiciary, when God said, here is a just penalty for theft, God is showing you how to love your neighbor. How do you love your neighbor when there's theft? How does a judge make sure that neighbor is loved when there's theft? How do you love your neighbor when there's a murder? How do you love your neighbor in terms of protection of human life? Well, I'll give you an example of loving your neighbor in the judicial system and case law system of the Old Covenants. It's not just laws that, they're meaningless laws and God was just throwing these out. They're just for them, no big deal. It was about love for neighbor. Jesus said so. God had in his law, he said, many people are familiar with this. God said you were to build a parapet on the rooftop of your houses. I love this example because it's such an easy one for us to grapple with. God says, build a parapet around the roof of your house, right? And we think like, well, okay, I got to do that today in a new covenant. No, it's a case law example. You take the principle of the law, that is an abiding principle of loving neighbor. And God gives you an example in culture and society, and he says, build a parapet around the rooftop of your house. Well, why? Because they used to spend a lot of time on the roofs of their houses to cool off at night, to store stuff up there and all the rest. And so because you had people, neighbors, hanging out on top of rooftops, you wanted to make sure that you preserved life. Why? Because you love your neighbor. And I want to say that principle does come over into the life of the new covenant believer. You ought to care about that. Why? Because the principle is abiding. Love your neighbor, preserve human life. How? Well, build a railing where there could be potential harm to human life, like on your rooftops where you're hanging out. The principle abides. So you say, well, how would that look in the life of the new covenant believer? Well, I ought to love my neighbor and be concerned with the preservation of life. So that means if I have a pool, what ought I to do as a new covenant believer who has a law written in my heart? I ought to care about the preservation of life, which means put a railing or put a fence around a pool. Or if you have deep wells in your property where little kids can fall into it, make sure you put a railing around that. Why? Because of the preservation of human life. You ought to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So when Andy argues that that's not your law, those aren't your commandments, he'll say things like, you've got something better. Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, that you're to love one another as I have loved you. Now I want to say this. This is a critical failure, I think, in Andy's thinking. And I mean this with all due respect. When he says, well, Jesus gives us a new commandment to love people like I've loved you. I want to say, because Jesus gives a new commandment, it doesn't mean that the old ones are irrelevant. Jesus is now the lawgiver walking among us now, God taking on flesh, saying, I've put flesh on this. Here's what I want you to do. Here's a new one. Love people the way I've loved you, like how I washed your feet, how I've served you, how I've given myself up for you. But watch, this is critical. Because Jesus says, I've given you a new commandment, it doesn't logically follow that now God's other commandments are irrelevant. He still requires of us to love our neighbor.